that was like kind of a eureka moment for me there. You
Yeah, it's
explained
basically like,
how you can embed the data.
yeah, you can basically use, so a public key is 32 bytes.
Right.
If we say that you can use 30 bytes for anything, and then all you've got to do is brute force the last few bits so that it becomes a valid point. Job done. It's then it will literally be obviously it'll have no value to it. It'll have no spending value, but it will be data that's on the blockchain that's not part of the financial transaction.
This week on Monerotalk is sponsored by Cake Wallet. Store, send, receive, and exchange your Monero and Bitcoin safely on iOS and Android too. Cake Wallet is open source, and you always control your own keys. And by StealthEX, an instant exchange where privacy is the top concern. Go to stealthex.io to instantly exchange between Monero and 450 plus assets without having to create an account or register, and with no limits, making StealthEX a simple way to purchase Monero with crypto anonymously. Monerotalk is also made possible from contributions by viewers and listeners like you, and supporting us is easier than ever. By typing in monerotalk.crypto in your monero.com or Cake Wallet send address field to send us a tip. This week on Monerotalk, Douglas Tuman interviews Monero developer JTGrassie. The two discuss the issues with TX Extra, why this field exists, the importance of making transactions uniform, why stuffing image data in a private transactions extra field is crazy, the reason most people in Monero are against having NFTs on the XMR blockchain, how mordinals could diminish privacy and fungibility, whether or not removing TX Extra is the solution, steganography, and more, followed by a must-listen Q&A session where Luke Parker joins the conversation. Monerotalk starts now.
All right, Jethro, what's going on, man?
Hey, how are you?
Pretty good. It's been a while. I was checking back at our last time you were on. It was like 3 years ago or
something like that. Yeah,
wow.
I've been busy.
You've been busy. I know. Lots changed since then, man. That was pre-COVID, I guess, right?
Oh my god. Yeah.
Wow, it's a completely different world.
New York is still the same.
Yeah, I think I saw you after. I think I saw you after COVID, right? We saw each other in the physical realm.
Yeah, Vic had a thing, didn't he? Yeah. Over on South Park.
Yep, that was after I had finished running for Congress.
I know.
What were you thinking, man?
No, I thought I was really impressed with what you managed to achieve, and
thank you, man.
It's just
yeah, you're local to New York, so you knew what I was like kind of up against, right? It wasn't.
I know, yeah.
That was fun and not fun at the same time.
Yeah, lots of dirty tricks in politics.
Oh my god, it's crazy. Yeah, I was looking back. The last time you were on, we talked about the perfectly binding and what was it? Computationally.
Perfectly hiding and computationally binding. Yeah.
Yes.
Pedersen commitments.
Yes. Which is a great talk, by the way. Anybody who's listening to this, I recommend you go back and listen to that. I thought that was a really good one. And it gets rid of some of the FUD that you constantly hear about Monero not being auditable.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a good convo. Yeah. So I wanted to have you back on to re-explain things to me again on a different topic.
Oh no.
The hot topic right now, which is TX Extra, and the fact that it's being used to do some things that may make, or certainly do, I guess we could say, make Monero less fungible, and what the dev community is doing about that, what they've already done, what they're thinking of doing, what the debate is. And I thought going to you would be a good way of getting the info out.
Well, I feel like I've definitely been debating it with pretty much everybody. So yeah, I can certainly give you my takes on it, but I don't think there's any perfect solution.
Yeah, give us your takes. Teach us.
I mean, well, so as I'm sure everybody knows, there's this there's this issue with transactions, and this issue's been there since the beginning. I mean, it's been known about. I mean, I've certainly been in discussions with people about it since about 2016, which is the TX extra field. And the issue with the field, for those that don't know, is that it allows any data to be added to a transaction. And until very recently, it was unbounded as well. So you could attach huge amounts of data to transactions. Now, the issue with that is you don't want transactions to look different from each other. So you want this thing called uniformity, so that every transaction which ends up on the blockchain, it essentially looks like every other transaction. And so over the years, we've been, there's been a number of other, so outside of TX Extra, there's been a number of other things that we've done over the years to create uniformity. So for example, the ring size in the beginning, you could choose your ring size. Like everybody could have different ring sizes, which meant obviously transactions would stand out. There'd be different transactions with different ring sizes. So you could have an exchange, for example, that was always using, I don't know, off the top of my head, like a ring of 5, and everybody else was using a ring of 1, or whatever the amount was. That basically they're different. So one of the changes, very early on, was to have a fixed ring size. And
some people use like incredibly large ring sizes too, right? Like,
they were. I mean, but the issue is that everybody was using different sized rings, and the wallet software allowed you to specify how many ring members you would have in your transaction. So that was quickly done away with by using a fixed ring size. So then every transaction had exactly the same ring size. So there was one element that we could make the transactions more uniform. And there's been other things as well. I mean, there's been a number of things over the years. I mean, that was just one that sprung to mind. And so with transaction extra, the thing is with transaction extra, we do actually use it right now. We need to set that record straight as well. Like, it is used in a normal transaction right now. The transaction public key goes into TX extra. If you use sub addresses, extra keys are added into TX extra. If you do a multi-sig transaction to multiple different destinations, then there are extra keys put in TX extra. So we do already use it. So the question is, the big question, now that there's this project which has come along and is now basically stuffing image data into TX extra, which with that aim of making non-fungible tokens, which is kind of crazy really for a privacy blockchain. That's not our goal. It never has been our goal. And you can
come on, you have some mordinals, don't you?
No, I don't have any. I really don't, because like there are plenty of other ways of creating image data stored on blockchains, other blockchains that are far more suited to the task at hand, because they're not privacy blockchains. So I mean, this is an interesting point, because like somebody that's not close to the community may look at this as a discussion about whether it's Monero, like people within the Monero ecosystem, either for or against NFTs on Monero.
Right.
But that's not really the discussion, because those that have been into Monero for any length of time, pretty much I mean, like, it's the overwhelming majority do not want to have Monero used for such purposes. The design of the whole goal of this is fungible digital cash, and that is the goal of the project. The goal of the project is not arbitrary data storage. It is not an EVM. it is not any number of other blockchain goals. Our goal is fungible digital cash. And so the overwhelming majority of people in the ecosystem, it's no question that that overwhelming majority do not want NFTs on the Monero blockchain. So if you move past that part of the discussion, you're then into some more nuanced arguments, which are, well, there's two sides to this. So one is, okay, well, what else do we use transaction extra for? So there are other use cases that haven't been developed yet or are in development. So for example, like atomic swaps, which could require storing extra data in the transactions. Makes complete sense. Just like subaddresses, when subaddresses were developed, if we didn't have transaction extra, we would have had to have added new fields into the actual transaction. It wouldn't be that we couldn't do subaddresses, it just makes it a bit harder because the change has to come in a fork then, because the transaction protocol would change. Whereas if you're just developing something and you don't have to create a fork because you stuff data in transaction extra instead, your specialized bit of data in transaction extra, then it allows a kind of an easy path for adding features, basically, that don't require any kind of fork. So that's
Offering was calling it like the junk drawer, right? Like it's like the
yeah, and the thing is, it's why, and it reminds me of the discussions in 2015, 2016, when we were talking about transaction extra. I mean, the whole goal of transaction extra was exactly for this use case, so that you could do other things, like whether it would be sticking in a hash for some merge mining, or those kind of use cases. But it was like, hey, there's other use cases, but we don't know quite what they are. So this field, those other use cases can use this field. The problem is with that, again, is that they're going to stand out like a sore thumb, because transaction extra isn't it isn't validated in any way other than the size, which, as I mentioned, was unconstrained until Tevador's patch very recently. So that's one side of the argument. It's like, okay, well, this field is great for adding features or adding unknown features in the future without having a hard fork. That was its original intent. That's how it's been used to date. But now it's being, I like to say, abused, because now it's being used for things that aren't to the goal of fungible digital cash. They're to some other goal, and in this case, it's mordinals, obviously. So putting image data on the blockchain and it not being fungible at all. Their whole idea is that it's non-fungible. The problem is with that, it's not that it's the people that their goal is fungible digital cash. They're not against using the data, like using the blockchain for other things per se. It's the problem of it is the impact to privacy that it can have. And the reason that it impacts privacy is because of the fact that we have ring signatures, and ring signatures use decoys. And if you're using decoys that are known, so they're non-fungible decoys, you're basically discarding those decoys, and you're essentially making it, you're reducing the set of potential decoys that a transaction could be spending. So it harms privacy on that level, and that's really what people are generally against.
Right, like if it could be done in a way where it wasn't affecting the anonymity set for decoys, or wasn't affecting the fungibility overall, nobody would care, right? Sure, like go have fun with your ordinals.
Well, yes and no. I mean, there is another thing to do with this though as well. It's not like okay, they're not impacting privacy, therefore, hey, go and do whatever you like with it.
Okay.
Because
Size.
there's another impact to, yeah, exactly. So if somebody is stuffing lots of data on the blockchain, that impacts every person that runs a full node. And sure, they may run a prune node. So great, like that's one way of combating that, is by basically saying, okay, well, we'll prune off all of the transaction extras. That is one solve, but it's like, all I'm getting at is there are other implications. It's not just, although it's the biggest one and the primary one that we're focused on, being the reduction in your decoys. There are other impacts. So there's an impact to cost and storage. So all of these things would come into play if something like Mordinals really took off. I mean, right now the numbers are tiny. Like it's really not taking off in any big way. And I'm pretty confident. I mean, here I am putting it down on recorded, but I honestly think that it's going to come and go, Mordinals. But the whether it comes and goes is besides the point. It is still something that needs fixing, because even if Mordinals doesn't become really successful, that doesn't mean that somebody else in the future doesn't do something similar.
You think it is naturally just going to come and go on its own, in that there's not a real desire for it?
I think so. I mean, I haven't looked at it in great detail, but if you think about NFTs on other chains, like the reason that they're part of the reason why they're successful is they can be traded. I don't know that there's a particular trading platform for Mordinals right now. I think right now it's just one of those fun things that people want to do. They think it's fun. It's like, hey, I can stick an image on the Monero blockchain, and I don't think there's any like big financial thing behind it right now.
Right, just kind of a novelty. Like
Yeah, thank you. Exactly, a novelty.
Yeah. Like I've got one of the few Monero NFTs that are probably ever gonna exist, because it's gonna go away. But yeah, so I guess the point, yeah, I was like Monero community. I know, like I personally would be okay with it if it wasn't affecting fungible digital cash. And like you said, it's doing that in two ways. One is the privacy, and the second is just the overall efficiency of the system, which affects fungible digital cash, right? It makes the system not as usable for digital cash purposes if transactions become more expensive and whatever. It becomes the nodes are getting too large too fast, right? So all those things play into it. But for
Exactly.
the end of fungible digital cash is what we're always keeping in the back of our mind as we make these design decisions.
Yeah, and like I think it's also worth pointing out that although Tevador recently did the patch to constrain the size of TX extra, so it's now like 1060 bytes, so just over a kilobyte.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't on its own like a thing to try and stop Mordinals. It was really plugging a gap that should have been there early on. Like the fact that there wasn't some kind of reasonable cap on the size of TX extra was kind of a miss. I mean, there is an overall transaction weight that can't be pushed, but for example, but here's the thing, like, so the cap at 1060 bytes is basically saying we don't want unconstrained data added to the blockchain. And in our current use cases, we could potentially need that many bytes for these public keys. So if somebody was doing a 16 output transaction and they were sending those 16 outputs to different people, then that's how much data would be needed by TX extra just for our current use cases. So it really is just a catch-all, basically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You mentioned, that there's things that it's been used for purposes of actually creating fungible digital cash, right? And things that we need, right? So sub addresses, and we didn't create these separate fields. Why didn't we? Obviously, it was just easier to do, right, to use TX Extra, but it seems like there wasn't the political will wasn't there to create these separate fields for these obviously necessary things.
Well, so, oh my God, we have to go right back in history because, and I don't know when, I didn't look at the code to see at what point it was used for this, but I'm pretty sure right from the start, TX Extra was used to add public keys. I mean, it's part of so there's like a byte that can be added in front of the data. So the way that Monero passes TX Extra, it's like a type length value field. And the standard types that Monero uses, one of those types is a public key. And we actually put the transaction public key in there. Now that's an essential part of the transaction public key, and it's been in there since the start. So although like transaction extra could be used for other things, like we actually do use it for other things, like right from the beginning. Now the question of why subaddresses used it, well, subaddresses needed to add extra public keys, and where do you stick extra public keys? You stick them in transaction extra, because there was already a way of passing transaction extra in Monero that looks for transaction public key, that looks for public keys in TX Extra. So it's the natural place. But as I said, like if we didn't have transaction extra, that doesn't mean that we couldn't do what we need it to do. We would just add an extra field for subaddress public keys. We could add a field for the transaction public key, which I'm surprised we don't already have, by the way. I mean, the fact that we stick it in TX Extra is kind of odd because it's needed verification. So the question there, so this comes on to the questions of, okay, well, how do we deal with transaction extra now that there really is something that's essentially attacking the chain, an idea that's essentially attacking the chain? It just brought the discussion back to the forefront, really. There's been no hostility. There's not really been any huge disagreements even. I mean, honestly, I've been in many of the discussions or watched many of the discussions as well. And it's an interesting problem to deal with because there's no perfect solution for it within our current transactions, within our current transaction protocol. There's no easy fix for it. And I can talk about those if you like, because they're the things that we're basically, every time there's a Monero Research Lab meeting about transaction extra, I mean, there's like a poll put up and there's lots of discussion, and like, honestly, even myself, like I can change my mind. I think I've changed my mind like 4 times already on which way I think is the best way. I mean, there isn't a perfect solution. So it's kind of like anything at this stage where I stand is like anything is better than the status quo. But
the initial move that was made to limit the size, obviously you think that was a good idea, right?
oh yeah, absolutely. Yep. I mean that it should have been there before. I mean, it's right. Like we don't want arbitrary amounts of non-transaction data being added to the blockchain.
Have we seen the effects of that? Has that have you kept your eye on that? Has that actually affected the Mordinals thing? Or
so it's only just been merged into a point release that hasn't even really been announced much. I mean, certainly pools will have been updating. I mean, I've updated a couple of pools to use the point release. I don't honestly think it's going to have much impact on Mordinals. And I can tell you why as well, because a Mordinal transaction, I imagine, is like one output actually has some kind of peak and arrows assigned to it. and another, and then they actually stuff the image and transaction extra, and probably a couple of extra bytes. But even with the cap, I mean, you know, a lot of the images that you see on Mordinals, I mean, they're way less than a kilobyte anyway. So they could quite easily continue to add images in TX Extra as it stands right now. They just, all they have to do is make sure that they're not adding loads of other transaction outputs. If they add loads of other transaction outputs to the same transaction that's adding the data, then yeah, then it may impact it. But that's not how people are using it. So.
But what it did mostly is send a strong message that the Monero community is interested in deprecating the ability for mordinals to exist. So this is the initial step we're taking because we can do this right away. But beware, we're going to be taking more steps against this. So you may not want to get so invested in this concept of mordinals because it's probably
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, but that where you're going with that is an interesting angle to where the conversation goes. Where I was saying that like there is no perfect solution. There's basically 2 or 3 kind of ideas that are being honed in on. So one of them is complete transaction extra removal. So we just completely remove the field. And the transaction protocol, whether we do it before Seraphis or not, I don't know. But we could remove transaction extra. We could add the other fields that we need for the current transactions that the wallets can do. And then if anybody wants to add an extra field, it would then have to go into a soft fork, which is fine. Or sorry, a hard fork to that point, actually, not even a soft fork. It would be a hard fork. Because we'd have to actually add something to the transaction protocol and the transaction format. So that's one route. The problem with that route, or the general consensus of, or not even consensus, but the known problem with that, and that is steganography. So steganography, there's really little we can do to stop somebody that really wants to add data to the transactions. They can do that. They can do it in outputs. They can get somewhere between probably, I think I was saying around 20, but I think it was Serge pointed out that it's actually, or Serge or Tevador pointed out, Sergey or Tevador pointed out, it's actually more like 30 bytes that could be used in transaction outputs. So a transaction output is 32 bytes, and it's a public key. So it's a curve point on the ED25519 curve. But it turns out that there's so many curve points, you can stuff, you know, up to, so let's say between 20 and 30 bytes of any data, and then just brute force the last few bits of the of what you're setting as the output key, just to find an actual a valid curve point. So essentially, people can still
that's how that works. Thank you for explaining that. You just, that was like kind of a eureka moment for me there.
Yeah, it's basically like
how you can embed the data.
Yeah, you can basically use, so a public key is 32 bytes.
Right.
If we say that you can use 30 bytes for anything, and then all you've got to do is brute force the last few bits so that it becomes a valid point, job done. It's then it will literally be obviously it'll have no value to it, it'll have no spending value, but it will be data that's on the blockchain that's not part of the financial transaction,
and that's acceptable by the network.
Yeah, exactly, and it will be accepted. And there's really, and it's not just the transaction outputs that can be done, and it's also in the range proof. So there are other. It's not just transaction outputs that.
How is it done in the range proof? Now that you just explained that,
it's exactly the same concept.
Okay,
exactly the same concept. Like, so you're basically you're making a range proof that if you remember what a range proof does, all it is doing is saying that it's essentially a positive value, so that you can't create coins out of thin air by providing a negative. So that look, the point is data can be like, if you use steganography, you can hide data in the transaction. So and here's where I go one way or the other with this, because part of it is by making a change as drastic as that. I mean, it really does force things like mordinals. They really have to work to do their thing. We're basically saying, hey, we really don't want your use case on the blockchain, and so we're going to make it hard for you. And okay, it's not really hard, but it's a barrier. And we're also, as you mentioned a second ago, we're basically saying that we don't want this crap on the blockchain. So it's a strong signal, and and we're providing some kind of disincentive for them to do it in the first place. That's what the goal is here. At the end of the day, the goal is to make it either financially prohibitive or whatnot. I mean, that's the goal. And so there are other things. So we just talked about the removal. So removal, okay, the problem with removal is that somebody could still get around that because they can use steganography. And one of the problems with them using steganography is we then can't easily identify them. And here's the problem: somebody could use steganography, and then they still publish all of the transactions. So they essentially still they have exactly the same problem. They still become known outputs in a decoy set that have been published by the projects like Mordinals. So they publish their list of all outputs that have got the Mordinal outputs, and boom, there straight away, all of those become decoys, which we would want to avoid. So like it's more problematic if we don't know them. Now there is a tool which surprisingly, and I don't know the background for why, but we did, and you'll remember this. There was a fork of Monero that was kind of like they were airdropping, and that impacted privacy because they were basically people were claiming coins on this other chain using their output. So we knew that, like, it was obvious that they were actual outputs that people owned that were unspent. And so a tool was developed at the time called the Blackball tool, Monero
right?
Blackball. And what that did was it basically said, okay, all of these outputs, we know that they're bad. We don't want to use those in transactions. So hey, you can run this tool. It will find all those outputs, and then you'll discard them from your anonymity sets, basically. Horrible UX which is, for the masses, which is what, that's another one of our goals. It's not just private digital cash, it's also easy to use private digital cash. And so, like, introducing tools like that people then have to use to make sure that their transactions are private kind of goes against a lot of our kind of founding ambitions, our founding goals. And like we always say it, I mean, I have this often when in the churning discussions. It's like your best, 9 times out of 10, actually churning is bad for your privacy. Like the whole point of Monero is, if you use it as it's designed, that is you're going to get a default level of privacy, basically. And doing anything different, you're risking that. So we don't want to develop a tool that's going to start blackballing again. I think it's a horrible UX. So then there's the camp of keeping transaction extra. So in the same way that you could avoid so if you know what people are using it for, then you can basically build that into the software to basically say, okay, well, any transactions that are using transaction extra and it's mordinals data, then don't use them as decoys. But what you end up with then is you end up with privacy puddles, basically, because you'll have a puddle of transactions which are mordinals, and another puddle which isn't, and potentially if something else launches, then there'll be another puddle. So it's kind of not ideal. So one of the other kind of things that's been discussed is like having transaction extra. So taking all of our current use cases out of transaction extra, and then keeping transaction extra as a 255 byte field. So and there's been a couple of variations on this as well, like suggestions, but one of them is like a fixed size, 255 bytes. Every transaction has it. And we also can do a statistical test to basically look at it and say, hey, that looks encrypted. So basically you can't put clear text data in transaction extra. There are problems with that though as well.
Didn't you write a tool for that? Because I was just recently like Googling to see what you've been working on, and didn't you?
So you can, you can, but it's not there are problems. So there are other problems with it. So
didn't you just put out some kind of tool to kind of figure out that could test to see if something is?
Oh no, that was just a quick entropy test, which is one way. Like, so if you've only got 255 bytes, any kind of half decent encryption algorithm, you should have close to 8 bits per byte in over 255 bytes. You're not going to have. If it was perfectly distributed, then there would be 8 bits per byte, but it's not going to be perfectly distributed. So you would set a number that, if you were just doing an entropy test, that would say, okay, well, if there's more than 7 bits per byte in entropy, then hey, it looks encrypted.
Mm-hmm.
And there are other tests as well, not just entropy. You could do chi-squared, a chi-squared test, again, which would be on distribution. There are other tests as well, and they're quick tests as well. None of these tests, especially if you're only looking at 255 bytes, these tests can be very, very quick, and so they can definitely be done at relay. So your node sees a transaction coming in, and it does its quick statistical test on TX extra, and it says, hey, yeah, this looks encrypted. The problem with that is, the biggest problem with that is the problem with a problem like mordinals is they're going to publish them anyway. So you're still going to know. So even if we're forcing encryption at over 255 bytes for everybody, the problem is the kinds of projects that would use it would potentially publish them anyway.
Right.
So we're back at square one in that sense.
Right.
People are still adding. I mean, the benefit here is over the steganography, so to speak, I think, and I go backwards and forwards on this as well, so don't hold me to any one camp. But one of the benefits of keeping transaction extra there is you could definitely force privacy puddle. So you could basically, one of the things I mentioned this the other day on IRC, like a potential idea would be to essentially never use transaction outputs as decoys if they're in a transaction that's using transaction extra. So that's one way of doing it, like basically having a transaction extra either on the transaction or not on the transaction at all. You end up with two very strong privacy puddles, and I'm not sure that I like that idea, but there's potential ideas.
Wait, how does that work? Can you
well, so basically, the idea would be you just don't use any outputs from a transaction that uses transaction extra.
Okay.
So you could basically say, hey, we're not interested in those transactions for decoys.
And what's the potential issue there?
Well, the potential issue there is that you end up with these two puddles, basically. These two, that you'll have a puddle of transactions that have transaction extra and those that don't. And there could be many valid use cases of using transaction extra. The one that comes to mind often, because I'm in the mining sector, is the use of it for merge mining, which is a very valid use case for that kind of field. Like, is for sticking a hash in there. So it's not ideal, basically. So look, there's no perfect there's no perfect outcome. And so another. So I had a long discussion with Alex at local Monero, and where we were basically hashing out something, and he actually won me round on a thing that he was suggesting at the time, which was, okay, well, what we do to really like his start, and I'm not holding him to this in the same way that nobody should hold me to my thing, because none of them are perfect outcomes. But the discussion we were having was about actually removing transaction extra entirely. So you're basically limited to steganography if you're going to try and do something like mordinals.
That's one.
And the addition that we were talking about, though, was also only allowing 2 outputs. So you're really restricting the amount of data that could be added into that transaction. So if somebody wanted to do an inscription, sorry, we don't call them inscriptions on Mordinals for some reason, but on Mordinals, the data that they add, they would have to create several transactions to spread their data out if we only allowed 2 outputs, for example, because if we only allowed
steganography more difficult.
So they could only basically add. So what we'd be doing, we'd basically be saying you can either do no financial transaction, and so you could use 2 outputs maximum, which would be 60 bytes. Well, you're not going to get an image. Most images that people are going to be interested in are not going to be 60 bytes. So they're going to have to do like 10 transactions of 60 bytes to get 600 bytes. So that was kind of one thing that we were hashing out. I mean, I started on that one with the dismissing the idea, really, because it takes away one of our use cases for doing batch transactions. So right now you can do a batch transaction and you can send to 16 people in one transaction. And so the use cases for that are typically centralized pools or exchanges.
We do. We send batch
exactly.
Gratuitous.
So it would kind of it wouldn't completely eliminate it, because, for example, if you're using the RPC to do a batch transaction, it's called split transaction, and what it will do is it will create as many transactions as are needed based on the protocol. So if there were only 2 outputs and you wanted to send to 16 people, well, that's fine. The wallet would basically create you your 8 transactions. The downside of this, of course, is we're forcing somebody to create more transactions, and so you still have the pollution. It doesn't solve the problem, basically. But it does make it harder. This is the thing. It does make it harder. So I think a lot of these ideas, they're all valid because they all make it harder, essentially. If we force them to steganography, it does make it harder for somebody that wants to do something like Mordinals. If we force it to be size restricted transaction extra that has to be encrypted, it makes it harder. Yes, sure. I mean, like, maybe 50% of the images would pass an encryption test. That's fine. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if some get through, because we're not concerned with the few. We're like with few getting through. We're concerned with making it harder, and there would be a significant number that wouldn't make it through without providing some encryption on it. It's all basically just making it harder for people to misuse. Of course, I haven't spoken about this at all yet, but it does come up in the discussion. Because here's the thing, like as I mentioned at the start, there's nothing we can do to stop steganography. That's a known thing. There's nothing we can do to prevent that. We can make it harder, sure. The real solution is a full membership proof, but we're just not there yet. We're some way away from that. I mean, we're still working on or not me personally, but there's people working on Seraphis to increase our ring size. Sure, that'll increase the ring size, but if 90% of that ring is sticking as transactions from mordinals, then there's still not much use, is it? But if we were using full membership proofs, then this wouldn't be a problem at all.
So when we had Justin on last week, so he basically was outlining and I think he's in the room, or he may have slipped out. Seeing the roadmap as being this initial step we took, which is limiting TX Extra's field, right, overnight.
Yeah.
Then next hard fork, coming to consensus on limiting TX Extra and encrypting it.
Yeah, well, I think the next hard fork will probably either remove it entirely, or it will keep it and it will be encrypted, or at
And
least
then
have a
after
statistical test.
that, try to wait for the full membership proofs, right? And that's when the real ultimate solution comes in.
I mean, it is the ultimate. Oh, I can't even speak today. It is the ideal
You're great,
solution.
man. You've explained things in ways that have yet to be explained to me. So
it is the ideal solution as a full membership proof, but I think we're some way off that right now. There is really only a minimal amount of investigation into full membership proofs right now. Most of the effort that's happening right now is into Seraphis rather than full membership proofs. I suppose the idea is that Seraphis will at least make the ring sizes much bigger, which will alleviate the problem somewhat. And it's also, as I understand it from the design, should be easy to switch out the membership proof as well. So when and if, I shouldn't say if, I'd say when we hopefully have a full membership proof one day, then hopefully that can just be plugged into Seraphis, or that membership proof swapped, so to speak.
Right, the way Seraphis is architected, you could
swap
potentially more easily swap a component out.
Exactly.
So where do you currently fall? Like, what do you in your mind? What do you see as being the ideal development roadmap?
I don't know. I don't know. Like you could, like, anybody could swing me in a 20-minute conversation. I can convince myself one way and then switch 20 minutes later. I think right now, the first logical step's been taken, right? So we're limiting to 1060 bytes for the current transaction extra. I think the next logical step is probably to reduce that size down to the 255 kind of byte size. And the reason I say that is that is a size that is big enough to store a few hashes in. So a hash being 32 bytes, that's a good chunk of hashes that could be added. And like most use cases for that field, and it's the same with Bitcoin, the op return field, which is, I mean, that's smaller than 255 bytes. It's 80 bytes, but the idea there is that it's big enough to stick a hash in there, and sticking a hash in there is beneficial for merge mining. It is beneficial for other kinds of protocols like atomic swaps or whatever the use cases is. 255 bytes is generous from an extensibility standpoint. So I think the natural easy path would be to restrict it to 255, move our fields out of transaction extra, and And I do think a statistical test is worthwhile. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be something that adds another hurdle,
Mm-hmm.
and that's all it would be. And it also wouldn't add, like, we'd obviously have to make sure that it's a very quick test. I think that's more. It's more important that it's quick than its result being correct. It's okay to let some stuff through that
Right, like you
isn't
said, as
encrypted.
long as it's creating some friction and
Yeah, exactly. That's all it would be for. Would be creating friction.
Hmm.
That's kind of where I stand. But then I say, like I said, I had that discussion with Alex from local Monero, where I kind of got swung round to his where he was leaning most at the time, which was
completely.
actually just getting rid of transaction extra altogether. And then we just have to fork in features as and when somebody needs to do it. If somebody starts doing some big merge mining thing, let's say Tari really takes off, and so we need to add some data into a field, then we can add a dedicated field for that use case, and it would be small. I don't know.
So then what is really the biggest risk with that approach is such that these new it would reduce the amount of experimentation that can take place before these type of ideas could even begin to be
I
real.
don't buy that argument, though. I don't actually buy that argument. And I'll tell you why. Because you can do the experimentation without it being on mainnet.
Right.
That's the thing. If you've got enough people that want to try it, like, there's nothing stopping you creating a fork of Monero with your code change in it. Stick your code change and a pull request in Monero, knowing that it's probably not going to get merged, but one day it might. I mean, think about, like, the way that Bitcoin is. I need to be careful with what I say here. Not that Bitcoin is perfect by any stretch of the imagination. It's not. But the notion of, like, basically proposing a change, getting kind of some consensus behind it, and then getting it merged, like, it would be the same thing. I mean, like, somebody would develop a feature. Let's say somebody wanted to do some atomic swap, and let's say they needed two fields. They needed 64 bytes. Well, then they would, in their development, they'd obviously add these extra fields that they would need to the protocol. And then if there was consensus amongst the community that it was a good addition to add, then it would get merged. That change would get merged. And it's as simple as that. It's not. It doesn't stop innovation. It just makes deployment a little bit harder.
Well, I
Because
guess arguably it stops innovation in that, TX actually allows you to test it in the real world to see if there's adoption for this new thing that you're trying to test, right?
I mean,
Like,
I
for
don't
example,
know.
we have Luke Parker's waiting. I think he's gonna jump. Like, if you can join us actually after this and do some
Oh, great.
Q&A. But he's building Sarai, right? And
I
my
know.
understanding is it's utilizing TX Extra. Uh,
Yeah.
so what in his scenario? What? So then he would be experimenting on another chain, because like.
Well, it's not that. It's really just about a development time, right?
Mm,
So I know a bit about Luke's work, although I haven't had a big discussion with him about it. But as I understand it, like, he could add this stuff using steganography himself, he could do that. And he definitely got the know-how to do it, so he could definitely do that. And it's not like he wants to stuff the chain with loads and loads of data, so he could certainly do it that way. He could certainly create a patch also that adds something for his use case, um, and there's no reason why it wouldn't get merged. I think the point is we'd be on a different track. If we go down the removing transaction extra, we're on a slightly different track to what we are now. We're basically saying, look, hard no right now, you've got to come to us with a use case, or you can go the hard path of using steganography. It's not ideal, don't get me wrong, which is why I lean, so sorry, Alex. I kind of lean more back to the other way of using transaction extra as it was originally intended, which was this field to basically add some data. Because I honestly think that, and it's not just Luke's thing, like anything that wants to do something that's outside of the protocol, they're almost always going to need to add 32, 64, 128 bytes. And so I think a 255 byte field is probably sensible to keep today, anyway.
Yeah.
So I feel today.
Yeah, I know. As you're talking, you had me convinced that we should completely deprecate it. But now you convinced me back the other way.
I want people to know though as well, like there's no real hostility here. Like it's not some hostile debate. So if anybody sees that and anybody sees people like trying to spread FUD about the kind of situation, it's really not like that. I mean, there's probably one person out of every 1,000 that
Right.
tries to get argumentative over it. But it really is like all the people that I've engaged with, everybody accepts that there isn't a perfect solution. Like honestly, most people get the pros and cons of both approaches, and probably most people have fallen in the same camp that I have, where I've probably changed my mind 5 times. But here's where I ultimately stand on it: any change is better than no change.
Do something.
That's where I really stand. I would not be opposed to somebody that said, "Hey, we're going to get rid of the field, and we're going to force only 2 outputs." I would still rather that than the status quo. So, and just as I like this current restriction of 1060 bytes, which I don't think really plays much part of the conversation anyway. I mean, it's the change, as we talked about, is a change that was needed anyway. But I think if we were going to keep a field, and let's say we were going to keep transaction extra at 255 bytes, which is one of the suggestions, like, fine. I mean, it's still an improvement on where we are. I think we're adding hurdles for the one particular use case, which is just embedding data. Like Luke's use case for this, like he's building something that's for financial transactions, right?
Right.
He's not just wanting to just arbitrarily stuff any old data on the chain, JPEGs on the chain. That's not his use case. He's trying to build something that is essentially going to benefit the privacy sector for financial usage.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an honorable kind of thing to work on.
How about the, where people's incentives lie, right? So do pool, because you're kind of privy to that part of that ecosystem. Do pool miners or do miners and pools perhaps prefer going the route of allowing something like ordinals to exist because it could lead to more fees, or that's not really playing into any of this?
I don't think I think there's definitely a fee argument on Bitcoin. I don't think there's so much of a fee argument on Monero because our fees are so low anyway. Which comes to the kind of third incentive play, which is okay. Well, let's make them more expensive. Let's disincentivize using the chain for by basically, let's say if somebody wants to use transaction extra, we make it 100 times the fee rate. So the thing is, I don't give that a lot of merit. I mean, I certainly thought about that idea as well, but I think the problem is that we always want transactions to be low fee, and even if we made it 100x, it's still not going to make it. It's not. I don't know that it's a prohibitive enough expense for somebody that wants to stuff a JPEG on the Monero blockchain.
Right.
Like 100, our transaction fees are like a cent or whatever they are now. So we would have to make it as a financial disincentive. It would have to be huge. We'd have to multiply the fee factor by a considerable amount. So I don't know that that's a solution. But back to your question, from a mining purpose, I don't think, honestly, I don't think there's any real impact for pools, whatever decision gets made. The impact is really for node operators, which obviously pools run nodes. Hey, I don't want to sync, personally, I don't want to sync and store JPEG data on the Monero blockchain till I'm dead. I just don't. Like, it's just more, it's going to add cost to the storage and more cost to the processing of that data. So anybody that's basically running a node is incentivized to not have that data on the blockchain. It's not just a miner thing.
Right, even miners. So yeah, so you don't really see there being there's not like Joe Schmo miner out there who really doesn't care about the protocol, isn't like necessarily a digital cash person, it's just a miner that's like, well, no, I love these mordinals. It's going to lead to, higher transaction counts, more fees.
I've not heard anybody say that from a mining perspective just yet. Certainly in the Bitcoin space with inscriptions, because obviously Bitcoin fees for the last year have been really low, and obviously Bitcoin's got its ticking time bomb with its security, because this is going down, and so there's a clear kind of argument that people are making on Bitcoin that it's good for Bitcoin because it's increasing the fees, which is therefore increasing the security. I don't buy that argument either, but I can see it being made on Bitcoin, and it is pushing up the. I think the last time I looked, to get into the next block, I think it was like yesterday, it was like 30 sats per V byte. So a transaction would cost upwards of $1. I'm doing head math on that, but there's certainly a case there, but I don't think it's not going to bump up miner revenue that much on Monero, because our fees are so low anyway.
Right. Okay. How do you where do you see things then going in terms of when we reach consensus? Is there a time that you see this happening, right? Like, so like you're saying yourself, you could go this way, you could go that way. I think that's kind of where everybody's currently at.
Yeah, I think quite quickly. Now, because I'm certainly not alone with this. Nobody's coming out strong on one particular way, and even if they do, they can easily change their mind. And like I said, I think that, and I certainly, it was Justin, I think, that I was chatting with the other day, where I think like anything's better than nothing. Let's go back to that. Like there's that point. I think so. It's just really a case of tallying up where we stand on who feels like what at the moment. I don't know. Like maybe in the next meeting or two, there will be more of a consensus, more of a leaning one way or the other, basically. But I'd expect it to be, and again, it would depend what we did as well. Like there are certain things that could be implemented faster than others as well. Like just restricting it to 255 bytes and moving the public keys to a different field, the public keys, like the transaction public key and the subaddress extra public keys. Like those public keys could be added to another field pretty quickly, and could make maybe our next hard fork. Whether Seraphis is ready for our next hard fork, I don't know. The change, to do whatever change we do, it's going to be easier than the total changes that Seraphis needs. So we could see whatever decision we land on, whether we keep transaction extra or we get rid of it, or we keep it and we encrypt it, wherever we land, I think we will probably see that. We could see it before Seraphis, and if we don't see it before Seraphis, we'll definitely see it at Seraphis.
All right. I think that's a good place to round out the hour there, and we can jump. Can you jump in the Q&A? I see Luke is in there. It should lead to some interesting discussion. Are you available to do that, Jethro?
Yeah, of course.
All right, cool. Yeah, so let's move over there. Luke, what's going on?
Nothing much. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invite. Just listening to the discussion so far while I catch up on some work.
Yes, so we wanted to get you here talking with Jethro, and I'll kind of remove myself from the convo a little bit. I just want the two big brains talking about basically what the convo we just had, but on a higher level on what you guys seeing the potential options to where we go with regards to TX Extra. So I would love to get your full take, Luke, and especially given the fact that your project would potentially greatly be affected by the decision that that's made with regards to where we go.
I'll do my best to keep my position brief. I don't exactly want to spend a full 3 hours reiterating things that have been said ad infinitum.
Yeah.
My position is simply that TX Extra isn't a privacy problem, it's a data storage problem. I know that there have been a lot of discussions about the fingerprintability of transactions that use TX Extra, about how if it's moved to steganography, how it's going to be creating more outputs. And because it creates more outputs, that's more chances for decoys. And if those decoys also have privacy issues, then there's a higher chance of your transaction being impacted, so on and so on. But I think any attempt to blame that on TX Extra or on arbitrary data storage is really just misdirected. The truth is that this privacy issue is a fundamental issue with the decoy selection model Monero uses. It doesn't matter if it's TX Extra making a transaction look different. It doesn't matter if it's someone creating 16 outputs and we start assuming those are data transactions. It doesn't matter if a charity publishes their view keys or if Sarai publishes its view keys, because that's one of the things we're doing. The end result is some decoys have their value as decoys reduced. But while TX Extra is one way that may happen, it's really just a problem with the decoy model. So when it comes to privacy, I really rather keep those discussions about the decoy model and about moving to full chain membership proofs, which would be done with what's colloquially called snarks, which was briefly brought up earlier. I won't go too far down that rabbit hole either. But since, in my opinion, Transaction Extra is a data storage issue, my stance is basically, I don't want people uploading, 200 megabytes of ugly images onto Monero so they can do a grift over here. I'm not trying to say all NFTs are grifts. I'm saying the concept of ugly monster pictures on Monero, I'm pretty sure that's a grift. And as part of that, yeah, I think TX Extra should be sanely limited. That doesn't stop people from going to steganography, and steganography is going to be less efficient than an arbitrary data field because even if you're using elliptic curve points, those are 32 bytes by default. Only about 30 bytes are going to be usable with steganography. And there's going to be some places you can't cram data into. So sure, it's going to be less efficient, but I think it takes a stance that the Monero community doesn't want to have this large amounts of data. It makes it clear it's a circumvention. And I think that the fees and UX of them are going to be significant. And hopefully that's enough to disincentivize it. While we could remove TX Extra completely and do all this work to limit steganography, some of it I'm for, some of it I'm against, the main thing I'd note is I think TX Extra has a lot of benefits. It's been advocated so we could update the wallet protocol more easily. This was mentioned with the transaction keys, which is what powers stealth addresses being included in Transaction Extra. When we moved to sub-addresses, we changed how the transaction keys are in TX Extra. Technically, we didn't have to launch sub-addresses with a hard fork simply because it didn't affect any of the protocol consensus rules. Transactions were still validated the exact same way. It's just Transaction Extra had more data in it. So TX Extra, one reason for keeping it would be the ability to change the wallet protocol, including in ways that would improve privacy and improve the user experience without having to hard fork. I can appreciate that, even if it's not my biggest concern. But the main reason I like TX Extra is because I think there are legitimate use cases for short segments of data. Personally, I kind of tap out at the 255 byte mark. whether that be Sarai, whether that be someone putting 32 bytes of a hash onto Monero to make a commitment. I think there's use cases for short segments of data. And Monero might disagree with me as a whole, but I do think we should keep some amount of data. We just shouldn't keep the ability to upload files.
All right. I guess, Jethro, I mean, you don't necessarily disagree with any of that, right? I mean, what's your response?
No, I mean, that's right. I mean, that was a lot of the same dialogue that I went through as well. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think there are plenty of valid use cases for sticking, for example, a hash on the blockchain that's not part of our current use case. I mean, merge mining is the most obvious one, which is a great way of allowing extensibility without polluting the Monero blockchain. And I think use cases like Tari are fantastic. Like that is designed for arbitrary kind of data storage and for it to gain its security from Monero by merge mining. I think that's a classic example of some of the great use cases, as are the thing that Luke's working on. I mean, I think there are plenty of things that we just don't know, but 255 bytes is definitely going to be more than enough for most of those use cases, if not all of those use cases. And honestly, right, people will find a way of making 255 bytes work.
There also is the argument, oh, well, if you're only doing short data segments, why not just use a hash, which would only be 32 bytes? And if it's as small as 32 bytes, we could feasibly force everyone to have it. And if we force everyone to have it, then you can't tell which transactions have data and which don't, and there's benefits that way. The reason why I still want messages on chain, and I'm saying this not to clarify anything, I just wanted to provide this bit of context. The reason why I want the ability to do messages on chain and not just hashes to messages, which, with all computer science would still say, yes, this is the message in this transaction. The issue is then you have to go find the message. So I can put a hash of the message in a Monero transaction, and later I can go on IRC, I can go on Twitter, and I can be like, yep, this is my message. I had the message at this time. Here's a Monero transaction confirming that. But I still have to provide the message somewhere. And this is actually the main problem Sarai started facing when I looked at ways to not use TX Extra. Our use case flow is someone makes a Monero transaction, they sent it to Sarai, and with it they say, I want Bitcoin, give me Bitcoin to this address. If you decouple the message from the transaction, Sarai may not know what to do with that transaction. It will say, oh yes, I see it has a message. I know the message exists. I don't have the message though. Because I don't have the message, I don't know if this should be exchanged for Bitcoin. I don't know if it should be swapped for Ether. I don't know if it should be swapped for whatever else. So that means we now have to set up a way for users to publish their message onto the Sarai blockchain, or at least to the validators of the Sarai blockchain. The easiest way is simply to make an RPC call. But this means that if you connect to, some node, it can actually censor your message. And if it censors your message, that means you'll still send your Monero to Sarai because you already made the Monero transaction, but you'll be unable to provide the instructions for it. And that means Sarai now has your funds. It can't return them because you can't send Monero back. And that's a can of worms for another day. But it also can't, exchange your Monero for the Bitcoin it wanted because it never told you. And you as the Monero user would then have to, set up your own Sarai node to guarantee an RPC connection. And it's all this work just to solve the problem that if you split up the message from the transaction, you now have to deal with making sure both of them are delivered in order to get a successful swap. Whereas if you put the message into the Monero transaction, you only have to be sure the Monero transaction is delivered. And if the Monero transaction is censored by a malicious Monero node, then you didn't lose any Monero because you never actually sent your Monero. So that's kind of the reason why, for Sarai at least, making sure the messages are present in the transaction is beneficial, and why just doing hashes doesn't exactly work for us.
Yeah, I mean, I use hashes as just an example, like the point being that...
Oh, there are plenty of systems that work with just hashes.
Yeah. But it's like, and your use case, like 255 bytes is probably going to be more than enough, I would imagine.
Even if we listed WoW Nero after Seraphis comes out and Jamtis happens, I think a Jamtis address is 114 bytes. Jamtis being the new addressing scheme under Seraphis. I think it's 114 bytes. So even if you're like, oh yeah, I have Monero and I want to swap to Monero, you're going to specify the 114 byte Monero address to send your Monero back to if something goes wrong, the 114 byte Monero address, and then maybe like 10 bytes of swap data. And as a whole, even with these much longer addresses we'll have under Seraphis, even if you're using 2 Seraphis coins, yeah, we'll still fit in 255 bytes.
Exactly. And here's the other point there as well. I mean, like, a lot of the decisions for Seraphis haven't been nailed down yet as well. I mean, we talk about this as if it's part of the Seraphis change. It's not necessarily. This change to TX Extra could quite easily come before a deployment of Seraphis. So I think there's still a lot of unknowns, but I think right now we just need a kind of loose enough consensus. Okay, this is where we're all leaning right now. We're mostly leaning on the side of keeping it at 255 bytes or whatever. Or, I think even if that's where I'm swinging today, that's where I'm leaning today. Sorry, on the keeping of it. I mean, I also can still see the arguments of removal, and you'll find your workarounds with the removal as well. I mean, you'll use steganography to stuff whatever data you need there. I don't think the problem with steganography, I don't think it's we're never going to be able to do away with steganography. So
it can be significantly limited. One of the main ways with steganography now, this came up when Justin Ehrenhofer was present. They're like, oh yeah, I asked Luke, and they can put 1,000 bytes into an transaction without using TX Extra.
Yeah, exactly.
The main way that occurs is actually via the ring signatures we currently use. So with Seraphis getting rid of ring signatures, that number's going to go down quite a bit. But no, it's still not going to stop the ability to put a couple hundred bytes of data in, and that's just how transactions are. And if someone puts data into outputs, that does not harm privacy under the decoy model. What harms privacy is them then telling people that have no actual value.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's basically people just publishing their view keys. The reason we call TX Extra such an issue is because people aren't encrypting TX Extra, and people can make assumptions about what outputs in transactions with TX Extra are. But if we really want to talk about failures of the decoy privacy model, I'm going to point everyone to snarks.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, look, and you know me as well. I mean, I definitely acknowledge the problem there as well. Like, obviously, the ideal solution is full membership proofs. I just don't I don't think we can move to a full membership proof model fast enough. Like, I think that's some time off. Like, there's a lot of effort now going into Seraphis, and I think the next logical step there'll be extra effort going into looking at full membership proofs. So we're certainly years away from a full membership proof, I would imagine. And so we just have to do what we can as we see the problem, and that's basically what we did with the PR 8733 with the restrictions of 1060 bytes for TX Extra. We can make an incremental change to restrict that even further, and just tweak our protocol so that we add our keys, our current keys for like sub addresses and multi-dest outputs to a separate field, and we can even go to the extreme of Alex's of only having two output transactions to further limit the ways in which people can add data in. But none of them solve the problem. But so it's kind of whatever we do, it's just a step towards a full membership proof. Like, we're taking baby steps. We know that there isn't a perfect solution right now. So we just have to do the thing that minimizes mischievous use of the data, and at least steps in the right direction of limiting people basically stuffing data on the blockchain, just stuffing non-transaction data on the blockchain, which I think overwhelmingly, most people seem to agree that like we don't want that's not a use case of Monero that we want. Like overwhelmingly, I would say.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Guess who's back? What's going on, man? You have a question to ask Luke and Jethro?
Yeah, I guess I was going to just offer a little bit of pushback. I felt like earlier there was characterization of the community not having consensus one way or another, leaning one way 20 minutes and another way the other 20 minutes. Just 2 weeks ago, we were absolutely ripping on Bitcoiners for having NFTs, on their blockchain. And if anything, I think the consensus is rip the thing out completely. That might be an overreaction because it's not possible because steganography, blah, blah, blah. But I think the whole consensus is we don't want monkey pegs, ape pegs on the blockchain. We don't want bloated blockchain issues with the nodes.
Great.
I think that's actually the consensus.
Yes.
To chime in a bit, I don't think anyone's at. I do agree that there's overall consensus. We don't want 1 megabyte monkey JPEGs, or even would probably say monkey JPEGs at any type. A few people might not mind pixel art that's a few hundred bytes. But the main thing I wanted to reach out is when we're discussing reaching consensus, what we're really discussing reaching consensus on isn't our opinions on NFTs, which is irrelevant. It's about the technical steps we want to take to either encourage data, limit data, or provide a best fit for data. And that's the problem that needs to be reached consensus on, because there are calls to remove TX Extra, which if I had to guess right now, I would say is 50-50. There's about half of the people who just want to remove it, but the other half does want to keep it. And then there's discussion among the group who wants to keep it. And there's discussion among the group who wants to keep it. Oh, do we want to keep it where you can have up to 255 bytes? Do we want to keep it where you can have up to 512 bytes? Do we want to keep it as an unlimited field? Do we want to force encryption on it? Do we want to have everyone always supply a fixed 256 byte segment so you can't tell which transactions have data and which ones don't? Personally, I think that's a bit spammy, and we should have TX Extra remain optional. There's the question of, should we only allow 32 bytes? So you can publish a commitment to data, but not the data itself. Therefore, so it's because there's all these different paths that the issue of consensus is being raised. And while there is overall consensus that this is a problem and it does need to be worked on, and that's why we recently pushed out a patch that limited the total size of TX Extra within a single transaction to 1,060 bytes. So there is consensus that it's an issue. There is consensus that it needs to be worked on. And there has been consensus on the first step, setting a higher bound. The question is, what do we want to do from a design perspective, and what do we want to do from a practical perspective from here?
I haven't really heard having them expire be talked about a whole lot. Having a distributed permanent storage, online storage platform is bad. But for your use case, for Sarai, it seems like you would only need a temporary notepad essentially for your transactions.
So there actually have been a few discussions about having it be prunable, especially so pruned nodes don't have to keep copies of TX Extra. And if we're discussing from a design perspective, if we were building TX Extra today, or as we're discussing hard forks or moving to Seraphis, yes, I believe it makes sense for TX Extra to be prunable. But I don't think the entire network, and this is me personally, I don't think the entire network should prune the data, because no, Sarai does always need to be able to point to the data and say that was the data at one point, and there's a bunch of discussions there. And if a significant amount of the network is pruning the data as soon as they receive it, then it effectively performs an eclipse attack, where nodes that may want to have the data aren't connected to any peers willing to carry the data. So there were discussions on this. It went down a few different routes about how it would be relayed, about light nodes, about changes to the transaction format, about is this just a commitment scheme, or how do we make it better than a commitment scheme and still have Monero suitably relay? So it definitely has been something discussed. It's just a lot of effort. And because it's a lot of effort and we don't have agreements to make this effort and to work on it, no one's exactly put forward a full proof of concept, because there'd be a lot of hours that may not be appreciated.
Yeah, and I'd also add that like the prunable, the notion of like prunable data, like it would very easily be prunable. Like I think there's no reason why we can't have transaction, like assuming that we move, obviously, move the things that we need in the transaction, like the extra public keys somewhere else. There's absolutely no reason why we wouldn't add transaction extra to one of the data fields which would be pruned. And if that's in the same model that we're already pruning, there will always be nodes that have got that data. So I wouldn't like, that's one of the benefits, I suppose, of how we prune right now. You're essentially working on you're retaining a random shard, and so there's always somebody that's got that chunk of data.
And of course, there's always going to be full nodes to keep every bit of data that comes along. From a design perspective, I would advocate for TX Extra being prunable in the current way we end up pruning. The design discussions that came up a few, 2 or 3 meetings ago were about a distinct pruning system tailored around TX Extra, so no light node had to keep any copy of the data. And under that, there were a lot more discussions about it.
Yeah.
But if we just simplify it to the current pruning model, yeah, I would support that.
Guess who's back? Where do you currently stand? Are you in the completely deprecate TX Extra camp?
I am for limiting anything that strays from the mission of being money, period. I don't care about any bells and whistles on the side at all. I think this whole issue coming out and kind of blindsiding the community shows that anytime you add any unnecessary feature, it adds a vulnerability. I think we should try to be as ossified as possible, and only focus on very cautiously branching into better ways of providing private digital cash. So if that includes snarks or whatever, fine. It doesn't sound like that's been audited enough to have the trust of enough people. I feel like Zcash was characterized as being the scientist and Monero as the engineers recently by a non-shopper.
Oh, you're going to drag me into an argument now.
I have a
well,
comments to make when I'm allowed a moment. If you want to finish your question or comment, of course, go ahead, get you back. But I do want to reserve a spot after.
Yeah, I wouldn't characterize it as academics versus engineers. I would characterize it as move fast and break things approach, because they have a much smaller market cap, they have much less responsibility and they're centralized, so it's easier to make those moves. I would rather be a little bit more towards the Bitcoin side of how slow development and cautious development is. I mean, obviously not to that extreme, but if there are people who are in our camp who are saying this hasn't been audited enough, for instance, Howard Chu has some criticisms, and if he's saying that there's problems with Z-snarks, then well, I am more leaning towards, okay, let's be cautious about that. And anything outside of those necessary changes for the mission of money, having a note, like, I don't want people writing on the back of my dollar bills. I don't want APEGs at all. I don't want Monero being used as distributed cloud storage. If anything, every time there's a hard fork, I would love to rug pull anyone trying to put APEGs on the blockchain, or War and Peace, or Encyclopedia Britannica. I mean, it's money. Fuck them. I don't care about their issues, or their business model is not my problem. We need something that can actually perform as money. Anything that ventures outside of that mission opens up doors of unknown consequences, in my opinion. It's very concerning. I'm not a software engineer. I'm not a computer scientist. So I'm already kind of looking at anything that's changing from that mission or adding any kind of essentially distractions or cracks as something that's very concerning. And I'll just leave it at that, I guess. And I don't think it's 50-50 people on the fence. If people could get rid of any kind of storage on it, I think it's much higher. I think there's been kind of a lot of talk about, well, there's nothing we can do about it, so a lot of people are throwing their hands up. That might be a large chunk of people. But a lot of people were saying, we can't defeat ASIC miners. Well, we defeated them. I think somehow there's a clever solution, no offense to anyone on the call, that stenography can be defeated. We can prevent blockchain from having to be used, being able to be used as a distributed cloud storage where everyone else is having to buy gigantic memory allotments for housing APEGs or War and Peace or Encyclopedia Britannica. I think there probably is a solution. I'm skeptical and I kind of don't buy it. Just like
so the main thing I wanted to talk about, and this is part of a wider set of commentary I've been building up. And to be clear, I'm going to be a bit of a dick here, and it's not personal to anyone on this call, I promise. One thing I've been frustrated recently in the Monero community is people who don't understand the issues commenting on the issues in certain ways. Monero has a very open development process, and it's one of the things I love about it, and I wouldn't change it for anything. But I am personally frustrated when people who don't have context on issues and hear about it start commenting, and I feel like this happened a lot with TX Extra. I feel like TX Extra became a very socially commented on issue, and this actually led to multiple comments on the GitHub issue, which already had over 100 comments. This led to multiple comments just saying, my opinion is we should do this, when that had already been discussed several times, and restating it doesn't mean anything. One person chiming in and saying that's their advocacy when it's clear they haven't read through the prior commentary on it and they aren't contributing new takes on it, new methods, new contributions, it really just becomes further noise. And I'm not trying to say that means the community's opinions are invalid, because no, we are here to listen to the community. Monero isn't decided by its developers. While the developers may put forth code edits, it's there to serve a community. If the community doesn't like the developers, they can and should get rid of those developers. But when it comes to the prior comments being made about snarks not being sufficiently reviewed and being cautious, Monero has always been cautious. It's one of the good things about it. It's one of the things I appreciate about it. But that means if we are looking into snarks, that snarks must be sufficiently battle tested. And what I would point to that is Monero currently uses bulletproofs. Bulletproofs is not a snark because the S in snark stands for succinct. Succinct means it's faster to verify than it is to create, or kinda. It's complicated. And that it's smaller. The proof itself is smaller than the statement being proven for. A bulletproof is smaller. It does great on the whole size thing. But with relation to the statement being proven for, it's faster to verify, it's slower to verify a statement via a bulletproof than it would be to verify the statement directly. So in this case, the bulletproof is saying that the transaction output amounts are sane. Yeah, it would be, and that statement goes through a long and complex process, blah, blah, blah. Technically, there's overhead when you verify it in zero knowledge via a bulletproof. And because there's overhead to do it in zero knowledge, it's not a succinct a snark. It's technically just a small narc, where the S stands for small instead, because it's smaller, but it's not faster. When we discuss snarks with Monero, we aren't discussing things like, there's this one very famous snark called a Graph16. A Graph16 requires a trusted setup. It requires some group to get together and set it up. And because of that, it's never really been considered for Monero. But it came out almost 10 years ago and has been used extensively and has extensive academic review and has proven security in multiple different ways. I think it's unfair to categorize snarks, of which Graph16 is arguably the epitome, as questionable or breaking edge when it's 8 years old, if I recall correctly, and has number of deployments and number of scientific review. While we can say, yeah, but it has a trusted setup and it's therefore not fit for Monero, and I would agree with that. With Monero, we're actually discussing, the first thing we're discussing right now, the immediate thing, is called curve trees. Curve trees actually just uses bulletproofs. Curve trees, which we would use to achieve a full chain membership proof, it literally defines itself as a pair of bulletproofs. So when we discuss curve trees, it is a large development effort. It is using some different theories. I'm not trying to say it's exactly the same as bulletproofs as we use them now, because obviously now we use bulletproofs for proving output amounts are valid. And here we would be using bulletproofs for proving that you are actually a legitimate input that exists somewhere on the Monero blockchain. But curve trees builds on bulletproofs, and we've already accepted bulletproof. So one thing I get frustrated by is when people are like, I don't know, snarks seem too new wavy for me. When we discuss quote unquote snarks, in this case, what we're literally discussing is just using bulletproofs more. When we already use bulletproofs, and if bulletproofs is broken, we have a lot more issues than if we use them for snarks or not.
Well,
and with TX Extra, we start to have a lot of similar discussions.
I just wanted to.
Sorry, go ahead.
I can come back to it if you want.
No, go ahead. I don't personally appreciate when snarks are kind of dismissed as being new wavy. I wanted to comment on that. I've personally been frustrated with people chiming in on TX Extra and they don't have a lot of experience. And the main reason I brought this up in this TX Extra discussion is because there was the comment, oh, I think eventually we can stop steganography. The whole point of steganography in the academic sense is that it's literally undetectable. And there are mathematical proofs that steganography is undetectable. You can say it's infeasible for large amounts, but to make it infeasible for large amount or for large amounts of data requires making it infeasible to make large amounts of outputs, which means it's infeasible to transact in Monero. And there's academic proofs about this. We can't stop steganography because steganography has mathematical proofs it can't be stopped.
Yeah, I'd wholeheartedly agree with that. I mean, the point about the kind of the snarks and starks, I did want to touch on one thing, like, so the bulletproofs. I mean, we use bulletproofs in a very defined purpose right now. We're using them specifically as a range proof. We're using them specifically to validate that an output amount is between 0 and an unsigned in 64 max. So we're basically just proving that they're a positive integer. So like using them in some other use case it is different, and it does require different review, and it does require different auditing.
Real quick, because you're not totally wrong, but from an academic standpoint, you are technically wrong. And I'm not trying to say we should always be talking academics. I just want to, as I'm trying to combat misinformation, technically the range proof, where the bulletproof says, yes, this is a valid Monero amount, the range proof is defined as one possible program for a bulletproof. And a bulletproof is academically proven to be able to run arbitrary programs. So when we discuss using bulletproofs in this different matter, it's a different program, it's a different application. And yes, we can easily fuck it up. And yes, it requires a lot more review. You're right in all those ways. The contribution I solely wanted to note is that all of the academic theory backing bulletproofs, the academic theory we relied on when we deployed bulletproofs for range proofs,
correct.
All of that still applies, and all of the security proofs carry too.
That's absolutely right, and I'd agree with that. Look, I'm not, as you may have seen recently as well, like, because I've commented on this in a couple of places, like, I'm not against like us going down a full membership proof model at all. Like, I think that's our eventual goal. I don't think anybody that's been developing Monero since 2014, 2015 would argue that point. Like, the ring signatures are the weakest element to our privacy right now. That is just a fact. Like, and anybody that argues the opposite of that is plain wrong. I mean, they are the weakest element of Monero. Sure, that's efficient.
We now spend a lot of time debating decoy selection algorithms to effectively use those ring signatures. So while we're not, currently updating the ring signatures too much, we are spending a lot of academic effort on using them correctly.
That's right. Yeah, we're basically, we've been doing with ring signatures ever since we switched over to ring CT is basically improving them. We've just been it's like been incremental improvements. So the switch to fixed ring sizes, making them faster, so on and so forth. And improving the decoy selection. All of these elements are incremental changes to a proof that is basically limited in size, which is what the ring signature is. It's limited in size right now to an anonymity set of 16. A full membership proof is definitely desirable, And it definitely solves a lot of problems from a privacy perspective, and also for stuffing data on the blockchain in a privacy harming way. So the thing is that I always like to come back to with this discussion, that's for later on. We're not there yet. We're not at the stage where we've got enough resources working on a protocol that is full membership proof based. We're just not there yet. Right now, the effort is Seraphis with hugely increased ring sizes, which is definitely an improvement, but it is still an incremental improvement to the design of Ring CT.
Could I ask a stupid question about stenography?
Go for it.
So if I were to do an atomic swap if I took my wealth in Monero and I did an atomic swap into, let's say, R, pirate chain.
How dare you?
Whatever stenography is on the Monero chain does not transfer to the R chain, correct?
Steganography is just data placed on a chain. The atomic swap would have no relation to it. If you want to say that you built a data scheme on Monero, similar to Bitcoin ordinals, where, this Monero amount of 500 piconeros is mapped to this monkey picture, and now I'm going to atomic swap it, the atomic swap protocol wouldn't care. It would say you have 500 piconeros and you're swapping them. You would have to build a protocol around the atomic swap protocol to continue that data perceived relationship. And that goes back to how is your data related in the first place, and under what protocol did you relate it in the first place?
Right, but the ape peg would be stuck on the Monero blockchain, correct? I'm kind of going somewhere with this.
If you put an ape image onto the Monero blockchain and you claim it's associated with an output, and then you atomic swap that output, the data isn't actually in the output. The data is on the Monero blockchain. That's just about the perception of ownership of the Monero ape picture.
Yeah, the picture's still on the blockchain.
So
it really depends on what ownership protocol you code around it. Because it's not like Monero acknowledges there's an ape picture and there's ownership of it. It's all about how a wallet chooses to perceive ownership of it.
Right, but there's no way for anyone on the pirate chain to associate that ape picture unless...
I mean, if you got a protocol that acknowledged both pirate chain and Monero, and it's like, oh, you can put data on either, and once you put data on either, you can assign it to an output, and we track all of those outputs, and you can use an atomic swap to exchange two outputs, and we track the data through it. It really just depends on how you coded this protocol around it. If you're talking about a protocol about how you view data, which is what ownerships of NFTs in these systems are, it's just a bunch of wallets viewing the data in a consistent way, giving the idea of ownership. If you're now interacting with Pirate Chain, you just need a wallet coded to do that with Pirate Chain. And then you need everyone else to agree with your definition of ownership and view.
Well, the reason I was bringing that up, and I also wanted to bring up Zcash's new trustless setup scheme that they've implemented with the turnstile of Z addresses going. It's basically first through the gate. Is now part of the new trustless setup. Z addresses, as my understanding. If we wanted to break stenography, couldn't Monero basically transfer into a new gate Monero so that old transactions go through and it breaks all the stenography that might be in the old transactions?
When we discuss stenography, we aren't discussing it, and we're not discussing you put it in an output and it's associated with the Monero output like the actual Monero coins are. When you create a Monero output, it has data on the blockchain. And by data, that doesn't actually mean data meaningful to wallets and to the Monero protocol as currency. The data on the Monero blockchain is just about how the Monero protocol is representing itself through a variety of ZK proofs and so on. So the steganography isn't putting it into the output as in the Monero wallet protocol, like the Monero as a currency protocol output. It's putting it into the output as in the ZK proofs and data we use to achieve the Monero protocol. So because of that, it literally doesn't matter what you do to the Monero as a currency protocol. It doesn't change the fact that the data isn't in the Monero as a currency protocol. It's in the Monero as an implementation protocol. So even if we did force people to reveal how much their outputs were worth when they spent them and moved them on, that doesn't matter. These outputs don't have any significance. It's just someone coded a wallet to argue, to perceive this output as having significance to some piece of data somewhere. You could write it where you have a torrent. You upload your monkey image to a torrent site. And then you're like, okay, I am saying that this output is ownership of that. As long as you have a Python script coded to do that, congratulations. You have now argued that under your Python script, ownership of this torrented monkey picture is associated with your Monero output. And that's that. You can then code your Python script to transfer it. You can code your Python script to detect the change of ownership in all of these different ways. But none of it matters to the Monero protocol. And even if you're forced to reveal the output amount itself doesn't matter. And there's no actual data in the Monero output amount anyways. So, you can code a higher level protocol to view anything it wants, any way it wants, but none of this steganography is actually in the Monero as a currency protocol. It's just in the Monero as an implementation protocol. And I think that's the confusion.
So there would be no way to basically create a gate so that old Monero goes through the gate, goes on a new blockchain that's pruned even, so that it's no longer, what is it now? Almost 60. How big is the current blockchain for nodes?
Pruned or unpruned?
Unpruned.
I think it's like 150 or something like that.
So there's no way to send Monero basically through a gateway that restarts
You could build a brand new chain and argue it's the real Monero. I mean, we could get them all together, create a new Genesis block, have the value have the Genesis block say, here's how much Monero it would supply, and then code it where anyone who burns their Monero on Monero can submit a proof that they burned the Monero to get coins on the new chain. It would be restarting the entire chain. There's no way anyone would ever agree to that. But that doesn't mean the data isn't on the old chain. And that doesn't mean you couldn't update your wallet software that's perceiving ownership to carry that perception to the new chain. You could have your old wallet, which says, yep, here's the data with this output. Oh, this output was burned to create an output on the new chain. Well, guess ownership follows, because it's all about how your local wallet perceives it. And you can make any piece of local software perceive anything it wants as anything it wants. You just have to code it to do it. Right now, I can fork the mordinals software, and I can add a system that perceives ownership transfers. And people can be happy with that. And then I can fork it and say, oh, now all the ownership happens on Ethereum. I looked at all the Monero perceived ownership transfers. I copied them onto Ethereum. Now my fork of the wallet software will only acknowledge the ones on Ethereum. And that's how my wallet perceives it. That doesn't mean people burn their Monero outputs for Ethereum ones. It doesn't mean that they sent their Monero to Ethereum. It just means I edited my code for the perception of ownership to now perceive ownership on Ethereum. And anyone can do that. And it all just depends on what the people who want to perceive ownership agree is the way to perceive it. If the community went with me and they're like, yeah, Ethereum's the better platform, let's just use Ethereum ownership. Cool, then according to the community of people who had NFTs on Monero, they're now NFTs on Ethereum. How it works. It's all just about how your software perceives it based on how it was coded to perceive it and who goes along with you.
So when you say the wallet perceives it, are you also talking about the actual data being stored as well, or just a reference point is being stored that might refer to an external server? Are you saying the data?
Code could be anything. All of these protocols have nothing to do with the Monero protocol. They may use certain implications of the implementation of Monero to achieve their protocol by using Monero as a messaging layer, but none of it actually connects to Monero output. And because Monero doesn't validate these messages that these wallets are passing and calling NFTs, the wallet is just applying its own view of the messages. And as the wallet is a piece of code, anyone can code it to view the messages a different way and handle it differently.
So in your opinion, there's no way to prevent someone from uploading 4K version of Avatar?
What I was saying is that turnstiles don't magically break perceptions of ownership, and that you could code an NFT software. So even if you did have to reveal your Monero amount and then make it private again, you could code your NFT wallet thingy to handle that. when it comes to uploading amounts of data via steganography's original purpose was to hide data into something else. It was meant to be a counter surveillance device. And as part of that, yes, it has been made undetectable. When you send Monero to someone, you use their stealth address, you create an output key, and that output key looks like a pseudo-random 32 bytes. If it didn't look like a pseudo-random 32 bytes, it could potentially break Monero's privacy. So because it's some presumably random 32 bytes, it turns out you can use most of those bytes for data. And the Monero protocol will never be able to tell because random bytes look indistinguishable from other random bytes. So as long as you make your 30 bytes of data appear random, which is trivial to do, the Monero protocol will never be able to detect or to stop it. Because steganography is perfect if you code it properly. If someone then wants to upload the entire 4K copy of Avatar to the Monero blockchain, 30 bytes at a time, I don't like that. I am horrified, but there's nothing Monero can do to stop them if it appears identical to regular outputs, unless it bans regular outputs as well.
Well, we just have to disincentivize. That's the ultimate point here. You
Paying
can't stop it
for 30 bytes. Like, even if the transaction fees are just a cent, imagine paying a cent for 30 bytes of probably a 100 gigabyte movie.
Yeah.
It'd be extremely expensive.
Yeah.
And that would be the disincentivization.
Exactly.
Well, thank you.
It was good chatting anyway. I do have to jump, but it was great to chat, Luke and Doug and Drunk Dial me.
Yeah, great convo. Jethro, greatly appreciate you taking the time, man.
And no worries, buddy.
Luke, thank you so much for jumping on. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you for the invite. And Jethro, it's great to be talking with you on this platform. You did great.
Likewise, man. Take care.
All right, guys. Thanks, everybody. Guess who's back? Thank you so much for participating as well and dumbing it down for some of us. Appreciate that. Thank you, everybody. Cheers. See you next week.
Thank you for joining us on this week's episode. We release new episodes every week. You can find and subscribe to our show on YouTube, Odyssey, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Go to Monerotalk.live to subscribe for a full list of places where you can watch and listen. If you want to interact with us, guests, or other podcast listeners, you can follow us on Twitter. And please leave us a review on iTunes. It helps people find the show, and we are always happy to read them. So thanks so much, and we look forward to being back next week.